Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Role models play an important part in all of our lives, whether we seek them out or not. And whether we walk the Buddhist path or not, they can have the power to shape the direction we take and the ability to influence the decisions that flow on from there. Life, with its ebbs and flows, challenges and opportunities, and at every turn we often seek wise counsel, examples that we can follow, and emulate people that we can respect or look up to, and much, much more. On the Buddhist path, the Buddha, for all intents and purposes, is our most eminent role model, teacher, and the Perfectly Enlightened One. There are also many noble and great disciples of the Buddha, those who have ordained as well as lay people, who were commended and praised by the Buddha for different qualities and or aspects of their practice. This will be a recurring segment on the podcast where we ask who are our role models and feature some of these great disciples of the Buddha. The aim is to learn about these noble beings and delight in their lives and accomplishments, learn from them, highlight the importance of recognizing them as noteworthy role models, and as inspiration towards the Noble Eightfold Path. Today we're going to look at one of the foremost Bhikkhuni disciples of the Buddha, and if you go to chapter 1 of the Anguttara Nikaya, so that's the numerical discourses, in that chapter 1, the 5th subchapter has a list of who Buddha has declared as the foremost of his Bhikkhuni disciples in a number of areas. So for example, there is Mahāpaññānaṃ Gautami, who is the most senior, or the foremost in seniority. You have foremost amongst those with great wisdom is Khemā, and Khemā is the one that we're going to focus on today. But she keeps company with Uppalavaṇṇā, who's the foremost in psychic potency. And then you have others like Dhammadina, foremost at speaking on the Dhamma, and many, many more. So you find within the Sutta Pitaka all these stories and discourses where the Buddha has either given a direct teaching to one of these bhikkhunis, or the Jatakas, which has the birth stories about these bhikkhunis. And then you also have things like the Dhammapada, which has verses expounded by the Buddha, and then various commentary to go with that. So we're going to look at Bhikkhunī Khemā today. And what's really useful to contemplate when you listen to Bhikkhunī Khemā's story is really around how she came to have this great wisdom and to be declared by the Buddha as having great wisdom. Also to know her former lives through the Jatakas, very interesting. And you can see how she built up certain parami over many lifetimes. And then on top of that, I think also what's quite important is it gives us a way through, one, the teaching of the Buddha to Khemā, but also her teachings to others, particularly King Pasenadi, on the Dhamma, and how she actually answered certain questions and the simile that she gave. And then to kind of contemplate, this is the kind of person that the Buddha held out as having great wisdom. And when you think about the way we perceive wisdom in the world today and who we assign almost like putting people on a pedestal, almost like the stark contrast once you see what Buddha holds up. And of course, if you were to look at the Arahants, the noble Arahants, and these other chief disciples of the Buddha, and of course the Buddha himself, that the yardstick for wisdom is completely different from how we perceive and how we rate wisdom in everyday life. So that's something that is quite useful as the backdrop to investigating and having a look at role models. So what I'll do is, again, I'll refer to the great disciples of the Buddha and what has been compiled by Nyanaponika and Helmuth Hecker. And throughout, I'll also give a bit of analysis and maybe just extra in terms of what they had to say to go along with that. Let's begin. Just as the Buddha has appointed 2 chief disciples in the order of the monks, Sariputta and Moggallana, he likewise named 2 women his foremost disciples in the Bhikkhuni Sangha, the order of nuns. These 2 were the Bhikkhunis Uppalavaṇṇā and Khemā, the former excelling in psychic power, the latter in wisdom. The Buddha has held up these 2 as the models and examples for all the nuns to emulate, the standard against which other nuns could evaluate themselves. The name Khemā means security and is a synonym for Nibbana. And what's interesting about Khemā is that yes, it is known as security. It's also known as safety, and I think that's how we apply it when we refer to it in Bhikkhunī Sutta. It can also be translated as calm or full of peace. And it's interesting that it's known as a synonym for Nibbana, because when you practice Karaniya Metta and the reference of how we wish all to be happy from a place of gladness and safety, it's really with the realization that as you start to cultivate Metta, when you truly understand what Buddha means and the insight knowledge pathway that he gives in the Karaniya Metta Sutta, that you do actually realize that the Buddha is referring to Nibbana, that is the ultimate security or safety from samsara and from all the constructed conditions that we experience in samsara. And so Bhikkhunī Khemā has been named quite rightly in this way, I would think. The nun Khemā belonged to a royal family from the land of Magadha. She was extremely beautiful and fair to behold, and when she reached marriageable age, she became one of the chief consorts of King Bimbisara. This king was a stream enterer, Sotapanna, and a generous benefactor of the Blessed One. He had donated his bamboo grove to the Sangha and constantly looked after the monks with great solicitude. But although Khemā often heard about the Buddha from the king, she resisted going to see him, fearful that he would find fault with her beauty of form and preach to her about the vanity of sensual pleasures, to which she was tightly attached. The king, however, found a way to induce her to listen to the teaching. He hired a troupe of singers to sing songs to her in praise of the harmony, peacefulness, and beauty of the Bamboo Grove Monastery. And because Khemā loved the beauties of nature, she decided to visit there. Decked out in royal splendor with silk and sandalwood, she went to the monastery and was gradually drawn to the hall where the Buddha was preaching. The Buddha, who read her thoughts, created by his psychic powers a beautiful young woman standing beside him, fanning him. Khemā was enthralled by this lovely woman and thought to herself, "Never before have I seen such a woman. I myself do not come within even a fraction of her beauty. Surely those who say the ascetic Gautama disparages beauty of form must be misrepresenting him." The Buddha then made this created image gradually change from youth to middle age and then to old age, with broken teeth, grey hair, and wrinkled skin, until it finally fell to the ground lifeless. Only then did she realize the vanity of external beauty and the fleeting nature of life. She thought, "Has such a body come to be wrecked like that? Then my body too must share that fate." The Buddha read her mind and said, "Khemā, behold this mass of elements, diseased, impure, decaying, trickling all over and oozing. It is desired only by fools." At the conclusion of the stanza, Khemā was established in the fruit of stream entry, or Sotapanna. Now, what's evident from this teaching that Buddha gives to Khemā is that it's a very piercing kind of teaching. It's definitely Kayanupassana, so the contemplation of the body, but it's almost like it's fast-tracked in front of Khemā's eyes, so that she actually sees the process of decay, the process of the breaking down of the body from youth to middle age to old age. And there are many ways of contemplating the body in this way that the Buddha gives in the suttas. Like when you come to the Kayanupassana, Buddha asks us to look at the charnel ground meditations. Buddha asks us to look at the body through elements, through the 32 body parts. But then also in other suttas, there's one in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 9, discourse number 15. It's called Ganda Sutta. The Buddha asks us to contemplate the body as a boil, where the body has 9 openings that ooze and discharge, and therefore it's unclean, there's a stench, and one should view it with disgust. Then there's also the Vijaya Sutta, which is in the I think the Sutta Nipata, and this is where the Buddha asks us to contemplate the 9 holes in the body. So 2 eyes, 2 ears, there are holes, 2 nostrils, the mouth, and then the 2 lower holes. And so when you contemplate it that way, you don't see it as attractive. And I mean, this is the thing about this teaching that the Buddha gives. The Buddha is actually asking to see asubha instead of subha. So instead of fair, seeing the body as foul. It is out of attachment to this body, when we see it as fair, that we want to create another eye, ears, nose, tongue, and body. And so when that happens, one is not free of samsara. And the minute it appears that you correct that view, which is what the Buddha has done with Bhikkhunī Khemā, is that the minute that he was able to correct that view, she attained path and fruit of Sotapanna. When you correct the view with respect to seeing something as foul rather than fair, then what happens is you start to realize that actually this body is not lasting, because as we know, this body, as it ages, it grows old, it can get sick, and therefore eventually it dies. And when you see that in that ultimate sense, it's not a lasting thing. You can't take refuge in this body, this vessel. When you see that, you understand that there is dukkha. Because of birth, there is this old age, there is sickness, and then there is death. And for that reason, then, the question you ask yourself is this worth taking as me and mine? Is it worth misapprehending this and being linked to samsara through many, many lifetimes? Now, what's also interesting is that Buddha gave this teaching many times, but he specifically also created an image of a beautiful woman that aged in front of one's eyes. And Buddha gave this teaching to his half-sister, to Nanda. And Nanda was also very, very beautiful. And when she saw this image that the Buddha created, she also attained stream entry, Sotapanna, and later on she also became an arahant. The contemplation that would be useful to look at much closer is actually this contemplation of aging, because this is really what Buddha is pointing to for Khemā. And in the sutta that looks at the 5 frequent recollections, this is in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5, discourse 57, you find this contemplation of aging. And the Buddha says, "For the sake of what benefit should a woman or a man, a householder or one gone forth, often reflect thus? I am subject to old age, I am not exempt from old age. In their youth, beings are intoxicated with their youth, and when they are intoxicated with their youth and engage in misconduct by body, speech, and mind. But when one often reflects upon this theme, the intoxication of youth is either completely abandoned or diminished. It is for the sake of this benefit that a woman or a man, a householder or one gone forth should often reflect thus: I am subject to old age, I am not exempt from old age." Now, a few key things here are how it relates to the intoxication with youth. Now, this is mada or vanity intoxication. This is something that if you've studied the Vatupama Sutta, the simile of the cloth, the 15th quality or mental stain that the Buddha talks about is vanity or intoxication, mada. And with this, there are 3 kinds, and one of them is this intoxication with youth, yobana mada. Now, when it comes to intoxication with youth, what this really means is that we are enamored, holding on to, very attached to youth. And so one becomes quite vain about it, especially when you're youthful. And that's not to say that an older person can't. How many times have we heard ourselves say, but I'm only 20, but I'm only 30, but I'm only 40, but I'm only 50. And an example of this is, when you're old and even you have illnesses and things, but you can even still have the thought at 70 or 80 that I'm still young. There's still someone older than me and I'm still going. So there are these types of vanities that come, that obstruct you from the right view. And likewise, in a more conventional sense, there's also denial that when you have lots of cosmetic creams, you have facials, you have different augmentations that one can do to the face, to the body. You can have surgery when the body breaks down or isn't to your liking. You can have plastic surgery and all kinds of things. And so when you have these options, it's a form of actually denying the aging process. But the fact of the matter is that even when you're young, even when you're a baby, every day we age, and every day we meet dukkha, when we actually notice the aging, when we come to a place that we don't like. Either it's we can't see well enough, we can't taste well enough, we can't hear well enough, our balance is not as it used to be, the flexibility in the body, the vitality in the body is not the same. And this is what the Buddha is talking about in terms of the aging process, the graying of the hair, the teeth, the receding gums, the wrinkled skin, the loss of vitality or luminosity of the skin. All these things that come with aging. And it's the over-ripening process. It's even how the digestion breaks down. How when you injure yourself and as you get older, you're not so quick to bounce back. That is also part of the aging process. And what happens is we experience pain, both emotionally and mentally as well as physically when certain things start to break down. And so Buddha's recommendation to actually contemplate this aging process, to actually give up the intoxication of youth, is something that is very precious when you actually start to contemplate it. Because out of the misapprehension, out of the intoxication with youth, we actually do a lot of misconduct. One, we might be the wrong kind of example for others. Two, we may talk in the way that is not the truth because we are glorifying youth rather than the reality of aging. And we think in the wrong way. And so when you contemplate aging in the correct way, then what happens is you correct your view, and then you start to really connect with this teaching, and then you start to refrain from misconduct. One of the other contemplations that the Buddha recommends, or that is said, is that we misapprehend sensual pleasures when we don't understand aging. So same with food, for example, we misapprehend food because we don't see the over-ripening process. You leave a plate of food out for 10 days, 20 days, 30 days, and you no longer want to eat it even after the first day because it's no longer palatable. It's overripe. There are probably insects and things wanting to eat that food, but you wouldn't eat that food. And so that's another example that with the aging process, even with something like food, it's something that is not fun in actual fact. And so this is quite a precious teaching of the Buddha. The one that Buddha gives to Khemā is very present and very piercing. And it's not the first time that he's actually given it. So, it's something that must be taken on board and earnestly looked at, I would say. Returning to the great disciples of the Buddha. But the Buddha continued to teach her, concluding his sermon with another verse. Those enslaved by lust drift down the stream, as a spider glides on its self-spun web. Having cut off even this, the wise wander, indifferent to the pleasures they've renounced. And that's from the Dhammapada, verse 347. Khema penetrated the sermon fully, and right on the spot, while still dressed in her royal attire, she attained arahantship together with the analytical knowledges, or patisambhida. Thereafter, having received her husband's permission, she joined the order of the nuns. So what's useful about this verse? Well, firstly, it's quite amazing that Khema attained arahantship right there and then, but she had particular parami. And what's useful about this verse is that Buddha is encouraging us not to be enslaved by lust, not to drift with the stream. So Buddha often uses the stream as, do you go with the stream or you go against the stream? So the Noble Eightfold Path is really walking against the stream of samsara. Whereas when you go with the stream, you're going with the same old, that you will still be misapprehending form. And in this case, you see it as subha rather than asubha. You see it as fair rather than foul. You don't see the danger of seeing it in that way. And not only that, because of that, you misapprehend. And you don't see the ripening, the aging process of form. And so this applies to all form, whether it's food, objects, or people. And particularly with people, we misapprehend even with those around us. We are in some kind of denial, some kind of ignorance, delusion around this physical form. And so when we deal with people, it's always in a rejection of seeing that aging process, even though it's literally happening in front of our eyes. And we spin the aging process to something more favorable to our liking. And therefore we keep going down the stream. Now, the Buddha uses this simile of a spider gliding in its self-spun web, because that's the web that we are spinning ourselves, that through the misapprehension we keep gliding on our own self-spun web. And because of that, we haven't given up tanha, the craving. We still abhinandati, abhivadati, ajosaya titati. We still take delight, we still welcome, and therefore we remain holding onto sense pleasures. And that includes our form, other people's form, and all the objects. And so when that happens, it's quite easy to see that we would create another ear, eyes, nose, tongue, body out of that misapprehension. But the Arahant, when the Arahant understands and corrects the view that because it is actually foul in nature, that this form does not last, it breaks down and eventually dies, that there is no lasting happiness in these forms, that one has to die, one gets old, one gets sick and then dies, that this formula is not something that we could take refuge in. And if we can't take refuge in it, then it's really saying, why is it that we value it so greatly? In actual fact, we should lessen our value for it, because it's actually a deception and something that won't bring lasting happiness. And so when you cut off the lust, and the wise wander indifferent to the pleasures they've renounced, what the Buddha means is that when you actually cut it off, that you cut off the craving, which is one of the links in the dependent origination, then what you're cutting off is this wrong view. And therefore it breaks the cycle of holding on, taking delight to the wrong thing, then holding on to it, clinging to it through the 5 aggregates. And therefore you won't come to exist. You won't want to come to exist. And as a result, there won't be this cycle of birth, old age, sickness and death again, and then sorrow, lamentation, grief and despair. And on the cycle goes. And so the Buddha talks about indifference to pleasures. It's because the view is corrected and you actually see very, very clearly. And this is something that Buddha is encouraging, that when he gives this teaching to Khema, she gets it. She actually realizes that there is nothing here through these 5 aggregates to cling on to, that they're hollow, that they're empty, and that only a fool would see them in the wrong way and misapprehend and therefore take refuge. And so the greatest refuge is actually the absence of that, the absence of the lust for that, the absence of the craving for that. And that is what the Buddha is teaching, that the real refuge is Nibbana. It's very, very profound at that level. An ordinary person hearing Khema's story sees only the wonder of the present happening. A Buddha, however, can see beyond this and knows that this woman did not come to full liberation by chance or good fortune. Such an attainment, almost like lightning, is only possible for one whose seed of wisdom has long been ripening and whose virtue is fully matured. In past eons, Khema had planted the roots of merit under many former Buddhas. Due to her innate attraction toward the highest truth, she always came to birth wherever a Buddha, a bearer of truth, lived. It is said that already 100,000 eons ago, she had sold her beautiful hair to give alms to the Buddha Patumuttara. During the time of the Buddha Vipassi, 91 eons ago, she had been a bhikkhuni and a teacher of the Dhamma. Further, it was told that during the dispensations of the 3 Buddhas of our happy eon, the predecessors of our Buddha Gautama, she was a lay disciple and gained happiness through building monasteries for the Sangha. While most beings drift around in heavenly or infernal realms during the lifetime of a Buddha, Khema always tried to be near the source of wisdom. When no Buddha appeared in the world, she would be reborn at the time of Pacceka Buddhas, or in proximity to the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha Gautama. In one birth, which appears in Jataka 354, she was the wife of the Bodhisattva, who always exhorted his beautiful and peaceful family thus: according to what you have, give alms, observe the Upasatta, keep the precepts pure, dwell upon the thought of death, mindful of your mortal state, for in the case of beings like us, death is certain, life is uncertain. All existing things must pass, subject to decay. Therefore be heedful day and night. One day, Khema's only son in this life was killed by the bite of a poisonous snake. Yet she was able to keep total equanimity, upekkha. Uncalled he hither came, unbidden soon to go. Even as he came, he went. What cause is here for woe? No friend's lament can touch the ashes of the dead. Why should I grieve? He fares the way he had to tread. Though I should fast and weep, how would it profit me? My kith and kin, alas, would more unhappy be. No friend's lament can touch the ashes of the dead. Why should I grieve? He fares the way he had to tread. With this particular story, you can see that she understood about sorrow, grief, lamentation, and despair. And so she was not torn up by it. She understood that when she says he fares the way he had to tread, she understood all beings are the owners of their karma, heirs to their karma. And in terms of grieving, that is where she had that measured view, that she understood the law of karma. And it's not that she didn't have grief or compassion, it's that just that it was balanced with the right view. Another time she was the daughter-in-law of the Bodhisattva, and this is in Jataka 397. Many times a great empress who dreamed about receiving teachings from the Bodhisattva and then actually received such teachings. So there are 3 Jataka stories about that, 501, 502 and 534. It is further recounted that when she was a queen, her husband the king was the future Sariputta. This husband in former lives was a righteous king who upheld the 10 royal virtues: generosity, morality, renunciation, truthfulness, gentleness, patience, amity, harmlessness, humility, and justice. Because of these virtues, the king lived in happiness and bliss. Khema too lived in accordance with these precepts. And that's Jataka 534. It is only because Khema had already purified her heart in many past lives that she was mature enough, on her first meeting with the Buddha to realize the ultimate truth in the twinkling of an eye. Khema's transformed attitude to sensuality is starkly revealed to us by a dialogue in verse recorded in the Therigatha, in which she fends off the advances of a charming seducer. According to the commentary, the seducer is actually Mara, the tempter, who had approached intending to divert her from the quest for liberation, vainly, as she was already an arahant. "You are so young and beautiful, and I myself am in the bloom of youth. Come, noble lady, let us rejoice in the music of a fivefold ensemble. I am repelled and humiliated by this putrid, fleshly body. Afflicted by illness so very fragile, I have uprooted sensual craving. Sensual pleasures are now like sword stakes, the aggregates are their chopping block. That which you call sensual delight has become for me no delight at all. Everywhere delight has been destroyed. The mass of darkness has been shattered. Know this, O evil one, you are defeated, exterminator." And that's from Therigatha 139 to 142. Now, when you really examine those words that appear in Therigatha, you can see by the first verse that Mara, as the tempter, is actually complimenting and talking about youth and beauty and being himself in the bloom of youth. And so at the same time, he's asking Khema to come and enjoy something very sensual, listening to music and that sort of thing. And in reply, in the 3 verses in her response, when she is very explicit in saying that she's actually repelled and humiliated, that's a bit like when the Buddha says many times, he says, atiyati harayati jigujati. Atiyati being, this is troubling, harayati, this is shameful. But Buddha actually says jigujati, which is disgusting. So many times you see that kind of response. And when Khema says repulsed and humiliated, it's a very similar statement to how the Buddha would actually say these things about conditions which are constructed and also not what they seem to be. And so she's very explicit in her response about this putrid, fleshly body, afflicted by illness, so very fragile, and she has uprooted sensual craving. I mean, what's quite evident is that she has this great wisdom, and she can actually see the precarious nature of this body, that it is actually not fair, it is actually foul, that when you actually look within it, a bit like those suttas about looking at the body as a boil, seeing it through the 9 holes in the body, as opposed to what's covered by all this skin and the clothes we put on it, and makeup and hair product and all those niceties to cover the body even. Or even when it's not covered, but when it's youthful, then it appears a particular way, like how you get very enticed by a young baby's skin as opposed to the skin of an old man or woman. And when you see through that, and it's not a personal thing, it's actually more of a collective understanding that with this body it ages, and that's not a fun thing. And not only that, Khema highlights that there is illness, and so she's saying it's very fragile, which it really is. Whenever we get sick, one doesn't know whether it's something serious or something quite, normal in terms of the body going through illness. And then you have things like cancer and heart problems and even the current situation right now in the world. And so she's saying it's very fragile. And this body is actually quite fragile when it is subject to illness. And therefore she says she's uprooted sensual craving. I mean, sensual craving is when you really misapprehend sense objects, and through the eye, ears, nose, tongue, you develop craving. and you remain holding to it because you have this wrong impression about sensual pleasures. And so then she goes on to say, sensual pleasures are now like sword stakes. So similar to how the Buddha says it's like burning, she's actually saying, well, it's like sword stakes, and not pleasant at all. It's a bit like when you see sensual pleasures, rather than what they're wrapped around, you see what's inside, and it's like a bomb that is going to go off, rather than something so pleasant on the outside. And then she goes on to say the aggregates are their chopping block. Well, it's through the aggregates that we remain holding, that clinging through the sensual aggregates, which is the way to experience things, is actually dukkha. And so she calls it the chopping block. And so she says there's no delight for her at all. There's no nandi at all for her. If there's no nandi, then there's no upadana. She will not cling to it. And if there's no clinging, then there's no coming to exist, which is the bhava. If there's no coming to exist, then there's no jati. There's no longer any birth, which for an arahant makes sense. So she has, towards any sensual pleasures, she is actually nabi nandati, nabi vadati, najosaya titati, which she has said she doesn't welcome these things, there's no delight, and essentially she won't remain holding. And so of course there's no craving, no clinging, and no coming to exist, no longer any birth, and therefore no old age, sickness and death. And in the final verse she says, everywhere delight has been destroyed. So that means she's completely uprooted the taints. So there's no longer a taint for sensual pleasure or sensual desire. There's no taint for becoming. There's no taint of wrong view. And there's no taint of ignorance. So she's uprooted those taints. So that's why there's no delight at all. And so the mass of darkness has been shattered. So the complete destruction of delusion, greed, hatred, and delusion. And so she defeats the exterminator, the evil one. So it's actually such a beautiful couple of four verses from the Therigatha that it's so completely done. And yes, you can see why Khemā is quite amazing. The Buddha praised Khemā as the nun foremost in wisdom. A dialogue that has come down in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 44, discourse number 1, known as Khemā Sutta, confirms this, illustrating how her wisdom made a deep impact on King Pasenadi. The king was travelling through the countryside of Kosala and arrived one evening at a small township. Wishing to have a conversation about spiritual matters, he ordered a servant to find out whether there was a wise ascetic or Brahmin in the town. The servant inquired everywhere. He could not find any ascetic or Brahmin for his master to converse with, but he learned that a Bhikkhuni, an ordained disciple of the Buddha, was dwelling in the town. It was the saintly Khemā, who was famed everywhere for her wisdom, deep insight, great learning, and perspicacity in discussion. When the king received this report, he went to her, paid homage to her, and with great respect questioned her about the after-death condition of a Tathagata, a liberated saint, a liberated sage. And so their conversation goes, "How is it, revered lady? Does the Tathagata exist after death?" "Great king, the Blessed One has not declared this. The Tathagata exists after death." "Then, revered lady, does the Tathagata not exist after death?" "Great king, the Blessed One has not declared this either. The Tathagata does not exist after death." "How is it then, revered lady, does the Tathagata both exist and not exist after death?" "Great king, the Blessed One has not declared this. The Tathagata both exists and does not exist after death." "Then, revered lady, does the Tathagata neither exist nor not exist after death?" "Great king, the Blessed One has not declared this either. The Tathagata neither exists nor does not exist after death." "How is this, revered lady, when asked these 4 questions, in each case you say, 'Great king, the Blessed One has not declared this'? What now, revered lady, is the cause and reason why this has not been declared by the Blessed One? Well then, great king, I will question you about this same matter. Answer as you see fit. What do you think, great king? Do you have an accountant or calculator or mathematician who can count the grains of sand in the river Ganges thus? There are so many grains of sand, or there are so many hundreds of grains of sand, or there are so many thousands of grains of sand, or there are so many hundreds of thousands of grains of sand. No, revered lady. Then, great king, do you have an accountant or calculator or mathematician who can count the water in the great ocean thus? There are so many gallons of water. There are so many hundreds of gallons of water. There are so many thousands of gallons of water. Or there are so many hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. No, revered lady. For what reason? Because the great ocean is deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom. So too, great king, that form by which one describing the Tathagata might describe him has been abandoned by the Tathagata, cut off at the root, made like a palm stump, obliterated, so that it is no more subject to future arising. The Tathagata, great king, is liberated from reckoning in terms of form. He is deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom, like the great ocean. The Tathagata exists after death does not apply. The Tathagata does not exist after death does not apply. The Tathagata both exists and does not exist after death does not apply. The Tathagata neither exists nor does not exist after death does not apply. And then the sutta goes on about, in the same way, about feeling, so Vedana, and also about Sanya, perception, in the same way about the Tathagata, and then also about volitional formations or sankharas, and then also Vijnana, consciousness, in the same way that the Tathagata has abandoned, cut off at the root, made like a palm stump, obliterated, and is no more subject to future arising. So King Pasenadi of Kosala, having delighted and rejoices in the Bhikkhunī Khemā's statement, rose from his seat, paid homage to her, and departed, keeping on his right. So back to the helm of Heka and Nyanaponika, great disciples of the Buddha. So to understand the reason, we must first understand what these four views imply. The views concern a Tathagata, which here means not only a supreme Buddha, but any liberated sage. The four views, however, conceive the Tathagata in terms of the category of selfhood, assuming that the liberated being is a substantial self. They formulate contradictory theses on the fate of that self. The first view, which is conditioned by the craving of existence, maintains that those who have reached the highest goal continue on after death in some metaphysical dimension, either as a distinct individual or as absorbed into some transpersonal spiritual essence. The answer is one given by most religions, including several later interpretations of Buddha. So this first one is actually quite common in today's manifested world. There are many religions and many views that one returns to some metaphysical oneness, and this happens after death, and that this is a form of eternalism actually. And when you go to the Buddha's teaching, you find that it is one of the wrong views. And so if you think that with the five aggregates, that when it comes to the end you return to some kind of pure consciousness or some kind of eternal dimension, then this is where Khemā was illustrating to King Pasenadi that the Buddha doesn't teach this, and therefore it is rejected, and it is not a reason to go with any of those questions that the king was asking. Particularly the first question, that he exists after death, or that any of us exist after death in terms of what happens. And so then the second answer, that a Tathagata does not exist after death, reflects the craving for non-existence, for annihilation. The theorist regards the Perfect One as a truly existent self whose fate at death is complete annihilation. From this perspective, deliverance is nothing more than the absolute dissolution of real self. So with this second one, complete annihilation actually doesn't understand the law of karma, and therefore what happens is you think that there's the complete destruction, that there's nothing after this life. And of course we know that the Tathagata does not preach this kind of Dhamma, but also that when King Pasenadi asks this question, then he's also alluding to the fact that is it that we all of us, including the Tathagata, that we're just completely destroyed at the end of this life? And of course the answer is no, that we are bound to samsara through many lifetimes of existence unless we are like the Tathagata and the noble arahants who actually completely uproot the taints. And so that's the second answer from Khemā to King Pasenadi. And then the third answer seeks a compromise. Everything impermanent in a Tathagata would be annihilated at death, but the permanent essence, his soul, would remain. The fourth answer tries to escape the predicament by formulating a neither-not solution, a skeptical approach that still implicitly accepts the validity of the Tathagata as a real self. So the third answer is actually trying to find some ground on which to stand on both. That there is something such as the body which completely breaks down and dies at the end, and therefore that's part of, I guess, the annihilation. But to compensate, there's still a soul that exists. And so there are some religions in the world that actually believe that. But again, Khemā is saying the Buddha does not teach this. That is not true. There is not this soul that still exists while the body dies and is completely destroyed. So if you understand right view, you understand the law of karma, you understand there is not this soul that moves from lifetime to lifetime. Rather that you understand that through the law of karma, one's actions and the balance of one's merit and one's actions is what determines coming back again. And it's through ignorance that the Buddha gives the dependent origination formula for us to understand that. Now the fourth answer, by saying that there's that neither exist nor not exist, is almost like the catch-all. It's a skeptical approach, is what is said in this particular great disciples of the Buddha. But it goes wrong again because it talks about the Buddha as a real self. And really, when you look at this fourth one, where Khemā actually really hits the nail on the head is when she goes through the 5 aggregates of clinging, because it is through the 5 aggregates of clinging that this misapprehension of self is created, this atta rather than anatta. Whereas really, how the Buddha teaches it is that it is things that are subject to conditioning, and we construct, everything is constructed through this conditioning. And when we misapprehend in this way, then we cling through the 5 aggregates to actually construct a self. And really, it's not the right view when we have that. And that is what binds us to samsara. So this is the way that Khemā explains it to King Pasenadi. So we'll go back to the great disciples of the Buddha, and it says, all 4 formulas have been rejected by the Buddha as wrong views. They all presuppose that there is an I distinct from the world, an I which is either raised to eternal life or annihilated in the abyss of nothingness, while in reality I and world are mere abstractions posited on the basis of the 5 aggregates that constitute the process of experience. Only in the enlightened ones and their wise disciples can actually see this as it is. Those who do not share this insight assume one of the 4 speculative views. They suppose either that an I, an essentially permanent self, is wandering through samsara, the round of birth and death, gradually ascending higher and higher until it is liberated into a divine essence, or they conclude that liberation is simply the destruction of a real self, or they attempt to formulate a syncretic position, or they fall into skepticism. The Buddha, however, teaches that there is no real I or self to be either projected into eternity or utterly destroyed. Such a substantial self has never existed and thus has never wandered through samsara. What we call I and what we call world are in reality a constantly changing process, always in flux. This process throws up the illusions of I and world, which then become objects of speculation regarding their past origin and future destiny. The way to liberation requires that we stop speculating about I, abandoning our habitual views and formulas, and directly examining the phenomena on the basis of which views of self are formulated, the concrete processes of mind and body. Liberation is to be won not by fashioning metaphysical hypotheses, but by observing with mindfulness the arising and passing away of the five aggregates: form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. All these phenomena have arisen due to causes, therefore they are impermanent, unlasting, and subject to dissolution. But whatever is impermanent and subject to decay cannot be self, since the five aggregates are subject to destruction, since they become sick, disintegrate, and pass away. They are not myself, they are not mine, they are merely empty phenomena occurring through conditions. Now, the sutta that is really helpful for understanding that is the Samadhi Bhavana Sutta. And in this sutta, the Buddha talks about the five aggregates and how that when you cling to any of the five aggregates through a particular formula, a particular insight pathway, then what happens is you create another birth. But then he gives another insight pathway that shows you how you don't create another birth. And essentially how you do it is through any of the five aggregates: form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. You actually say Abhiṇhapaccavekkhitabbaṭhāna, which is you take delight. In this instance, let's use form. Then you say Abhivadati, which is you welcome it verbally, this particular form. And then what happens is you then remain holding, which is Ajosayatitati. When you do that to form, so form can be a piece of chocolate cake, it can be another person, it can be oneself. When you take delight, welcome, and then remain holding, what happens is, Buddha says, you take delight, you go into Nandi. When you take delight, as in Nandi, then you cling. So that's Upadana. And in the case of form, this is Kama Upadana, clinging to sensual desire. When that happens, then you want to come into existence. So bhava comes to exist. And so when that happens, that leads to birth, jati. And so when that happens, you have jati pidukkha, you have jara pidukkha, and then you have maranam pidukkha. So the birth, old age, in between sickness, but also death. And so the whole mass of suffering comes again. And so you do that with both feeling and also perception, volitional formations, and then consciousness. But Buddha gives this other insight pathway, which is the opposite of that. And the Buddha says that in the case of form, which we're using as the example, is if you say, Nabhinandati, I don't take delight in this form, Nabi wadati, I don't welcome this form, Najosayatitati, I don't remain holding to this form, then of course you don't have the delight, you don't have Nandi, you don't have the clinging, Upadana, and you don't come to exist again, and you don't create another birth. And so that's a very powerful sutta to meditate on And you go through each of the aggregates meditating in that way. Firstly, the insight pathway that leads you to coming back, and then you meditate on the insight pathway that does not come back, and you go through each of the aggregates in that way. Because all views of self are only mental constructions, products of speculative thought, any designation of the enlightened one after death is an illusion born from a compulsive urge for conceptual certainty. Whoever has followed the Buddha's teaching as Khema did is greatly relieved to see that the Buddha did not teach the destruction of an existing entity, the annihilation of self. We live in a world of perpetual destruction and uncontrollable transiency. In the realm of death, and whatever we look at as I and mine is constantly vanishing. It is only by renouncing these things that we can teach or reach a refuge of true peace and security. Thus the Blessed One proclaimed, "Open are the doors to the deathless. Let those with ears send forth faith." In her discussion with King Pasenadi, Khema illustrated her point with a simile. When she asked the king whether he had a skillful mathematician or statistician or calculator who could calculate for him how many grains of sand were contained in the river Ganges and also how many gallons of water are contained in the great ocean, the king, when he answered, he considered it impossible to actually calculate that with regards to the grains of sand, the Ganges were innumerable and incalculable. And when it came to the ocean, that the ocean is deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom. And so Khema says, just so is the Tathagata. Whoever wishes to define the perfect one can only do so through the 5 aggregates. Yet those who have reached awakening no longer hold to any of them as their personal identity. The Tathagata is released from reckoning by form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. He is deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom like the great ocean. Therefore, it is not appropriate to say that after death the Tathagata exists or does not exist, or that he both exists and does not exist, and that he neither exists nor does not exist. None of these designations can define the undefinable. The king rejoiced in the penetrating explanation of the nun Khema. Later, when he met the Buddha and asked him the same 4 questions, and the master replied exactly as Khema had done, using the very same words, the king was amazed and recounted his conversation with the holy nun Khema, the woman disciple who excelled in great wisdom. So we can see why Khema, Bhikkhunī Khemā, was foremost at wisdom and declared so by the Buddha, because her wisdom was based on right view, and she had corrected all those perversions around seeing fair in the foul, seeing happiness in the painful, seeing me and mine in the not me and mine, and seeing lasting in the unlastingness, or permanence in the impermanence. And so particularly around the subha, the fair and the foul, this was something of how she penetrated the Dhamma. And her wisdom, you can see, is not about worldly mundane wisdom. It's actually not about glorifying mental defilements, nor was it about breeding the kind of behavior that would enable you to remain in samsara. Instead, her wisdom was that of the Tathagata and the noble ones. It was about the way to completely uproot the taints. And like when you consider this question, like in our world, who do we raise in terms of great wisdom? Who do we consider as very wise, very learned? And many times when you answer that question, the question comes back about people that can make the quality of life, our quality of life, better, who come up with inventions or retain knowledge that may be of use to the world, who investigate and find solutions to problems in the world. So it might be in the sciences, or it might be in history, or the social sciences, or some of the other areas of the world that we consider they have great wisdom. But the question you then ask is, how many of these so-called considered wise people in our world do we know that have the knowledge to end birth, old age, sickness and death? Because that is the wisdom of the Buddha and the noble Arahants, and someone such as Bhikkhunī Khemā. They actually know the path that leads to no more birth in samsara, therefore no more old age, no more sickness and no more death. And when we ask ourselves, is there anybody in the world that we know today that actually through sciences, social sciences, history, and all the learned topics and knowledges that we have in our world, do they have the answer to that? Can they give with complete certainty the path that leads to no birth and therefore no age, no aging, no sickness and no death? And the answer is actually no. That they can come up with temporary solutions to aging, as we've mentioned, and temporary solutions to sickness. But essentially, we all face that same predicament of having birthed this body. We are subject to old age, sickness, and therefore death. And so when you look at it that way, you really have this wondrous, respectful, humble view towards someone like Bhikkhunī Khemā, who actually penetrated that, but had so much wisdom to be able to understand the Dhamma, but then to be able to share it with people who such as King Pasenadi, who had quite complex questions, and those which veer into wrong views, and to be able to correct them in such a way. And then all the noble Arahants and those that have gone before us, and of course the Buddha, the Tathagata, the fully enlightened one, all on his own. It's quite incredible when you think about it that way. And so when you look at it that way, it's something that's how you need to contemplate wisdom. That the wisdom that the Buddha teaches is actually very, very precious and completely different from the wisdom that we hold out and raise up in the world. And so when you see it like that, you really have an appreciation for the Buddha and his noble disciples, for those that have walked this path, those who have understood it completely and completely uprooted the taints. And it's a source of inspiration for us to actually tread quite carefully, to actually learn from these great disciples, and in this case Bhikkhunī Khemā, with her 4 analytical knowledges and great wisdom. So completely amazing. So I'll share this today as the who are our role models, person that we're looking at, and we can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy, may all beings be well, wishing in gladness and safety that they be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wish you all well. Teruan Saranai.